The farmer's rifle. The worn Springfield rifle looked like something a sharecropper might use to hunt rabbits. Staff Sergeant Bill McKenna had carried it through 3 campaigns, its walnut stock scarred and darkened by sweat, the bluing worn thin on the barrel from countless cleanings. When he'd been captured outside Bataan in April 1942, the Japanese guards had laughed at the old weapon before tossing it aside with the other American equipment. They called it farmer gun in broken English, mimicking the action of shooting rabbits. Now, 18 months later, in the work camp outside Cabanatuan, that same rifle would change everything. The heat pressed down on the compound like a wet blanket, thick with the smell of tropical decay and human exhaustion. McKenna wiped sweat from his forehead as he watched the daily work detail form up near the main gate. Nearly 3,000 American and Filipino prisoners moved with the careful deliberation of men who had learned to conserve every ounce of energy. The railroad construction that would connect Japanese supply lines across Luzon demanded more than most of them had left to give. At 34, the former hunting guide from Montana had become something he'd never intended to be, the unofficial leader of Barracks 7. His woodcraft knowledge helped men find edible plants during work details, and his steady temperament had prevented more than one desperate act that would have brought collective punishment down on them all. But leadership in this place meant watching good men die from disease, malnutrition, and the casual brutality of guards who viewed surrender as the ultimate dishonor. The morning inspection was routine now, Lieutenant Colonel Watanabe walking the lines with his measured pace, his boots clicking against the packed earth. McKenna had learned to read the commandant's moods in the set of his shoulders, the way he held his ceremonial sword. Today, something was different. Watanabe's jaw was tight, his movements sharp with suppressed tension. "Attention, prisoners," the commandant announced in accented English. "New orders from regional command. Work quotas will double, effective immediately. Any prisoner who fails to meet standards will forfeit rations." The words hung in the humid air like smoke from a funeral pyre. McKenna felt the shift in the men around him, the barely contained rage that he'd learned to recognize and diffuse before it exploded. Double quotas meant death for the weakest prisoners. It was a sentence disguised as discipline. That evening, as McKenna lay on his bamboo mat, listening to the sounds of men slowly starving, he thought about the storage shed behind the commandant's quarters. He'd spotted his old Springfield during a work detail in October 1943, recognizing the familiar profile even under its layer of rust and grime. For weeks he'd said nothing, planning. The rifle had been forgotten, buried under confiscated personal effects that the Japanese considered worthless. Just another piece of American junk, dismissed with the same contempt they showed for the men who had carried such weapons. But McKenna knew that old Springfield better than any woman he'd ever loved. He'd hand-loaded ammunition for it in his father's barn, adjusted its sights on countless Montana mornings, felt its familiar kick against his shoulder as deer fell clean and quick in the Bitterroot Mountains. In the darkness of the barracks, listening to Rodriguez cough up blood 2 bunks over and watching Private Kowalski shake with fever, McKenna made his decision. The rifle was still there. He'd checked during yesterday's detail. The guards' patrol patterns were as predictable as sunrise, and somewhere in that shed, if he was lucky, there might still be ammunition. The moon was dark when he slipped from his bunk at 2:30 a.m., moving through the camp with skills learned tracking elk through mountain snow. Each step was calculated, each pause timed to the rhythm of the roving guards. The shed sat in the longest gap of the patrol cycle, 4 minutes and 30 seconds of relative safety. Inside, his fingers found the Springfield exactly where he'd last seen it. Someone had removed the bolt, probably as a precaution, but McKenna located it wrapped in oiled cloth beneath a stack of confiscated photographs. He spent precious minutes in the darkness, hands reading the familiar geometry of the weapon like Braille. The bore was dirty, but not rusted through. The trigger mechanism felt solid. Most importantly, he found a small cloth pouch containing 8 rounds of 30-06 ammunition. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. How do you prepare to become the thing your captors never expected you to be? Getting the rifle back to Barracks 7 required 3 trips over 2 nights. First the stock, then the barrel and action, finally the bolt and ammunition. McKenna's bunk was positioned against the back wall of the building, where a loose board provided access to a small space beneath the structure. By November 28th, he had reassembled the weapon and spent hours cleaning it with improvised tools. Strips of cloth torn from his spare shirt, palm oil traded from a Filipino prisoner who worked in the kitchens, even his own urine to neutralize rust. The work was meditative, familiar. In the mountains of Montana, he'd performed this same ritual 1,000 times, preparing for hunting season or after a day in the field. His hands remembered the proper tension for the sling swivels, the exact pressure needed to work the bolt action smooth and quiet. But this wasn't about hunting deer anymore. The camp was surrounded by 7 guard positions, 3 watchtowers, 2 machine gun nests, and 2 roving patrols that covered the perimeter. Each position was manned by 2 to 4 Japanese soldiers who rotated every 8 hours. McKenna had been studying their routines for months, noting which guards were alert, which were lazy, and most importantly, which positions offered concealment and clear fields of fire. He'd identified the critical weakness. The positions were designed to watch for prisoners trying to escape, not to defend against attack from within the camp. The angles were all wrong for mutual support. If someone could eliminate the guards quickly enough before they could raise an alarm, the entire perimeter would collapse. "You're planning something," Rodriguez said quietly one evening. The former aircraft mechanic from San Antonio had developed the same instincts that kept him alive working on bomber engines under fire. "I can see it in your eyes." McKenna looked at his friend, really looked at him. Rodriguez had lost 40 pounds since Bataan. His cheeks were hollow, his uniform hanging loose on his frame like a scarecrow's clothes, but his eyes were still sharp, still alert. "Maybe," McKenna replied. "Maybe not. Whatever it is, count me in. This isn't your fight, Rodriguez." "Like hell it isn't." Rodriguez's voice dropped to a whisper. 2 men from Barracks 3 got shot yesterday for allegedly stealing rice. How long before it's our turn? The executions had shaken the camp in ways that increased rations or improved conditions never could have. The Japanese garrison was increasingly nervous about potential rescue attempts, as word filtered through the prisoner network that General MacArthur's forces were advancing faster than expected through the central Philippines. Fear made captors dangerous, and dangerous captors made desperate choices. McKenna thought about Sergeant Kowalski, the tough Polish kid from Detroit who died 3 days ago from dysentery. About Martinez, the quiet radio man who'd simply stopped eating and faded away like smoke. About all the men who'd believed that surrender meant safety, that following orders meant survival. In the guard tower nearest to the chapel, Private Tanaka finished his evening meal and settled in for another long night watch. The 20-year-old farmer's son from Hokkaido had volunteered for overseas duty to bring honor to his family, but 18 months of guard detail had worn his idealism thin. The American prisoners were stubborn and prideful, refusing to accept the shame of surrender with proper humility. They organized themselves, shared resources, maintained military discipline despite their defeat. It was frustrating and, if he was honest with himself, somewhat admirable. Tanaka adjusted his rifle and scanned the compound below. The prisoners were settling into their evening routines, washing with cold water, mending clothes, playing quiet card games with decks made from scraps of cardboard. Some wrote letters on toilet paper, though mail service was sporadic at best. Others simply lay on their bamboo mats, staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about home. In Barracks 7, McKenna completed his final inspection of the Springfield. The weapon was as ready as improvised maintenance could make it. Tomorrow, word would spread that work quotas were doubling again. Men would begin to understand that survival meant something different than they'd thought. And in the makeshift chapel, a lean-to structure that gave him a clear view of Tower 3 while remaining invisible from the other positions, he would take the first shot at 180 yards. An easy shot for a man who had once guided wealthy hunters through the Montana wilderness. The plan that formed in his mind was both simple and impossible. 7 positions, 8 rounds, and maybe, if he was very lucky and very good, 11 minutes that would transform broken men back into soldiers. What does it take to remember that you're still a warrior when everyone has forgotten your name? The first shot came at dawn, on November 30th, just as the morning shift was relieving the night guards. McKenna had positioned himself in the camp's makeshift chapel at 6:18 a.m. Watching the lazy handoff between exhausted sentries, Private Tanaka was scanning the jungle beyond the camp perimeter, never imagining that death would come from behind. The Springfield spoke with authority, its sharp crack echoing across the compound. The guard in Tower 3 simply disappeared behind the wooden railing, and McKenna was already moving, running in a crouch toward the laundry area, where he'd cached additional ammunition. Around the compound, prisoners startled awake began to understand what was happening. Tower 1 fell at 6:23 a.m. McKenna's second shot took the guard in the chest, spinning him around before he collapsed across his rifle. The sound of the Springfield was becoming a signal, not just of rebellion, but of something the prisoners had almost forgotten: hope. The machine gun nest on the eastern perimeter required a different approach. McKenna circled wide, using the camp's crude buildings as cover, and took his position behind the carpentry shop. The 2 guards were alert now, searching for the source of the shooting, but they were looking in the wrong direction. When one of them raised his head above the sandbags, McKenna was ready. The shot at 243 yards was the longest of his life, but the result was immediate and final. The remaining guard in the nest began firing wildly into the camp, his machine gun chattering in short, panicked bursts. McKenna's 4th shot silenced him at 6:31 a.m. Around the compound, prisoners were beginning to emerge from their barracks, moving with the careful deliberation of men who had learned not to hope for too much, too quickly. Tower 2 fell during the 7th minute of the engagement. The guard had been trying to reach his radio when McKenna's bullet found him. By now, the Springfield's barrel was hot to the touch, and McKenna could smell the distinctive odor of burning cosmoline as moisture evaporated from the metal. He had 3 rounds left. The western machine gun nest proved the most difficult target. The guards had taken cover and were calling out in Japanese, their voices high with fear. McKenna knew he needed to end this quickly. Other Japanese positions outside the camp would have heard the shooting by now. He moved to the water tower, climbing the rickety ladder with the rifle slung across his back, ignoring the bullets that began to buzz past as the remaining guards spotted him. From 30 feet above the ground, McKenna had a clear view into the machine gun position. His 6th shot killed the gunner instantly. The 7th shot, fired 3 seconds later, dropped the ammunition bearer as he tried to reach the weapon. The entire engagement had lasted 11 minutes. The final position, a roving patrol that had taken cover behind the camp's generator shed, surrendered without firing another shot. 2 terrified Japanese soldiers emerged with their hands raised, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of power in a place where they had ruled absolutely for 18 months. As the sun climbed higher, prisoners began the methodical work of securing weapons and planning their next move. They had perhaps an hour before Japanese reinforcements arrived from the main garrison 12 miles away. But something fundamental had shifted in those 11 minutes. Men who had been reduced to numbers, who had forgotten they were soldiers, stood straighter as they moved through the compound. McKenna found himself surrounded by prisoners who wanted to touch the old Springfield, to hold the weapon that had given them back their dignity. Rodriguez ran his fingers along the worn stock and shook his head slowly. "Bill," he said quietly, "I never would have believed it. That old farm rifle." The escape that would follow became legend among the survivors who eventually made it to MacArthur's advancing forces. Of the 127 prisoners who walked away from Camp Cabanatuan that morning, 89 would survive to see liberation. McKenna would carry the Springfield through 6 weeks of jungle warfare, leading his group through Japanese patrols and Filipino collaborator checkpoints until they reached American lines on January 14th, 1944. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. When the moment comes to choose between who you were taught to be and who you need to become, what wins? The immediate aftermath of the 11-minute engagement revealed truths that no one had been prepared to face. As prisoners secured weapons and began organizing their escape, McKenna found himself confronting the weight of what they'd just accomplished. 7 guard positions neutralized, 14 Japanese soldiers dead. The camp's entire security structure collapsed in less time than it took to eat a meal, but the victory felt hollow in ways he couldn't yet articulate. These weren't faceless enemies from propaganda posters. They were young men like Private Tanaka, who'd kept a small photograph of his family tucked inside his helmet. Rodriguez had found it while stripping weapons from Tower 3, a picture of an elderly couple standing in front of what looked like a farmhouse, their faces creased with pride and worry. "Look at this," Rodriguez said, holding up the photograph. "Kid couldn't have been more than 20. McKenna took the picture, studying the faces of parents who would never see their son again. In his mind, he could hear his own father's voice from a hunting trip 15 years ago. "Every shot you take changes you, Bill. Make sure you can live with the change." The escape plan was necessarily simple. 3 groups of 40 men each, moving through different routes toward MacArthur's advancing forces. They would travel at night, lie up during the day, and live off the land using skills that most of them had learned as boys. McKenna's knowledge of woodcraft would be invaluable, but so would the organizational abilities of men like Rodriguez and the language skills of prisoners who'd learned enough Tagalog to communicate with friendly Filipinos. The rifle that had started it all remained with McKenna. He'd found additional ammunition in the guard posts, enough for perhaps 20 more shots if they encountered Japanese patrols. But every time he looked at the Springfield now, he thought about the sound it had made, echoing across the compound, the way hope had flickered to life in men's faces, the way Private Tanaka had simply disappeared behind the wooden railing. Lieutenant Colonel Watanabe had been found in his quarters, apparently having committed suicide when the shooting started. His final act was both predictable and heartbreaking, the ultimate expression of a code that valued death over the dishonor of defeat. In his desk, prisoners found correspondence revealing the pressure he'd been under from regional command, the impossible quotas imposed from above, the steady erosion of resources that had made the doubled work requirements a mathematical certainty. "He was as trapped as we were," Rodriguez observed, reading over one of the letters. "Different cage, same desperation." The comment unsettled McKenna more than he cared to admit. The narrative they'd all carried, good versus evil, freedom versus tyranny, us versus them, was proving inadequate to explain the complexity of what they'd lived through. The guards who'd seemed like monsters were revealed to be frightened young men following orders. The commandant who'd issued death sentences had been responding to pressures from his own superiors. As the first escape group prepared to move out, McKenna made an impulsive decision. He walked to where Tanaka's body lay and placed the family photograph gently on the young man's chest. It was a small gesture, meaningless in the grand scheme of war, but it felt necessary. "Why'd you do that?" asked Private Chen, a Chinese-American soldier from California who'd endured additional persecution because of his appearance. Because somebody should remember that he was more than just a uniform, McKenna replied. The jungle that awaited them was beautiful and terrifying, a green maze of possibilities and dangers that would test every skill they'd retained from their civilian lives. But as they slipped away from the camp in the pre-dawn darkness, McKenna realized that the hardest part of their journey wouldn't be avoiding Japanese patrols or finding food and water. The hardest part would be carrying the weight of what they'd learned about themselves, about their enemies, and about the thin line between survival and becoming something unrecognizable. The Springfield felt heavier now, burdened with more than just the weight of wood and steel. How do you carry a story that no one back home will be able to understand? 6 weeks into their escape through the Philippine jungle, McKenna's group had been reduced from 42 men to 31. Not from enemy action. They'd successfully avoided most Japanese patrols, but from disease, exhaustion, and the simple mathematical reality that some bodies had been pushed beyond their limits at the camp. Each loss was a calculation that McKenna had learned to make without flinching, though the weight of those decisions settled deeper into his bones with every mile. The Springfield had fired 16 more shots during their escape, twice to take game that kept them fed, once to signal their identity to a Filipino guerrilla unit that might otherwise have shot them on sight. The remaining 13 rounds had been used in 3 separate encounters with Japanese search teams. Brief, violent exchanges that left McKenna's group intact and their pursuers scattered or dead. But it was during a rest stop in an abandoned village near Tarlac that McKenna discovered the secret that would haunt him for the rest of his life. They'd taken shelter in what had once been a schoolhouse, its walls still decorated with children's drawings and a map of the world that showed the Philippine Islands as a tiny speck in a vast Pacific Ocean. Private Chen, exploring the building's back rooms while looking for anything useful, found a wooden box hidden beneath loose floorboards. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in English, addressed to families in places like Omaha and Detroit and San Francisco. Personal effects that had been confiscated at the camp but never destroyed. Instead, someone, probably Lieutenant Colonel Watanabe, had collected them, hidden them, preserved them. Look at the dates, Rodriguez said, examining the letters more closely. Some of these go back to when we first arrived. McKenna studied the careful handwriting on one envelope addressed to Mrs. Sarah McKenna, Bozeman, Montana. His own letter, written 8 months ago and never sent. Inside, in his own careful script, he'd tried to explain to his wife what capture felt like, how the men around him maintained dignity in impossible circumstances, how the guards weren't the monsters that propaganda had painted them to be. Dear Sarah, the letter began, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to write it anyway. The things we were told about the Japanese aren't entirely true. They're cruel sometimes, yes, but they're also afraid and far from home and following orders just like we were. The guard who gave me an extra cup of water yesterday has a picture of his daughter that he shows to anyone who'll look. She's about the same age as our Jenny would be now. The letter continued for 3 pages, describing acts of small kindness, moments of shared humanity, the complex reality of life in a place where enemies were forced to see each other as human beings. It was the kind of truth that would be impossible to tell back home, where people needed simple stories about good and evil, where admitting complexity might seem like betrayal. Why do you think Watanabe kept these? Asked Chen, holding up another letter. Maybe because he understood something that we're just figuring out, McKenna replied. Maybe because he knew that the truth is always more complicated than the story. They spent that night reading letters that other men had written but never sent. Stories of guards who'd shared cigarettes during air raids, of a camp doctor who'd risked punishment to treat American prisoners with the same care he showed Japanese patients, of small acts of mercy that existed alongside the cruelty and fear and desperate attempts to maintain authority in an impossible situation. By morning, McKenna had made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would carry these letters out of the jungle, along with his rifle and his memories and his complicated understanding of what war actually looked like when stripped of propaganda and comfortable distance. But he would also carry the knowledge that most people wouldn't want to hear the truth about enemies who turned out to be human beings. The Springfield that had started as a symbol of liberation was becoming something else, a reminder that every shot carried consequences that extended far beyond the target, that violence was sometimes necessary but never simple, that the line between hero and killer was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. As they prepared to leave the schoolhouse and continue their journey toward MacArthur's lines, McKenna tucked his own letter into his shirt pocket, along with a photograph of Private Tanaka's family that he'd carried since the escape. Some truths he was beginning to understand were too heavy to carry alone, but too important to abandon. What do you do with the truth that makes heroes uncomfortable and history books incomplete? They reached American lines on January 14th, 1944, emerging from the jungle like ghosts returning from a war that most people would never understand. Of the 127 prisoners who'd walked away from Camp Cabanatuan that November morning, 89 had survived to see liberation. The numbers would be recorded in official reports, filed away in archives, reduced to statistics that revealed nothing about the weight of what they'd carried. McKenna kept the Springfield. Army regulations were flexible enough during wartime to allow a soldier to retain a personal weapon that had proven its worth, and no one questioned the decision of a man who'd led 31 prisoners to safety through 200 miles of enemy territory. What they didn't know, what McKenna never told them, was that the rifle had become something more complicated than a tool of war. The debriefing sessions were thorough, but incomplete. Intelligence officers wanted to know about Japanese troop movements, supply lines, defensive positions, and strategic capabilities. They were less interested in the human details that McKenna found impossible to forget. The guard who'd wept while reading a letter from home, the camp doctor who'd smuggled medicine to dying Americans, the commandant who'd preserved letters that revealed the complexity of their shared experience. "Did you observe any instances of prisoner abuse?" asked Captain Morrison, the young intelligence officer assigned to McKenna's case. "Yes," McKenna replied, which was true. "Did you witness any violations of international law regarding prisoner treatment?" "Yes," McKenna replied again, which was also true. What he didn't add was that he'd also witnessed violations of propaganda that painted entire populations as inhuman monsters. He'd seen fear and homesickness and small acts of mercy that complicated every simple story about good and evil. He'd learned that enemies could be cruel and kind, that war made monsters of everyone, while occasionally revealing the stubborn persistence of human decency. The letters from the schoolhouse traveled with him back to the United States, hidden among his personal effects. He'd considered turning them over to military authorities, but realized that they would disappear into the same archives that would reduce the Cabanatuan breakout to a single paragraph in official histories. Instead, he carried them to Bozeman, Montana, where he began the impossible task of trying to explain to his wife and daughter what 18 months in enemy hands had actually taught him. Sarah McKenna was a practical woman who understood that her husband had returned different than he'd left. She listened to his stories about the escape, about the rifle, about the 11 minutes that had transformed broken men back into soldiers. She was less prepared for his insistence that the Japanese guards had been human beings caught in an impossible situation, that war was more complicated than the newsreels suggested, that victory and defeat were inadequate categories for understanding what actually happened when enemies were forced to live together. "People need heroes, Bill," she said one evening as they sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun set over the Bitterroot Mountains. "They need simple stories that make sense of all the sacrifice." "I know," he replied. "But what if the simple stories aren't true? The Springfield hung above their fireplace, its stock still bearing the scars from those desperate months in the Philippines. Visitors who didn't know the story saw only an old hunting rifle, the kind of weapon a farmer might use to shoot coyotes threatening his livestock. McKenna never corrected them. The truth was too complicated for casual conversation, too heavy for most people to carry. He returned to guiding hunters and fishermen through the Montana wilderness, using skills that the war had refined, but not fundamentally changed. His clients were usually wealthy men from back east who wanted stories about their guides' war experiences, tales of heroism and clear moral victories that would fit comfortably into their understanding of American righteousness. McKenna learned to give them what they wanted, edited versions of the truth that emphasized courage and downplayed complexity. But late at night, alone in his study, he would read through the letters that Lieutenant Colonel Watanabe had preserved. Letters that revealed American soldiers as frightened young men, missing their families, confused by a war they couldn't fully understand, capable of both cruelty and kindness depending on circumstances beyond their control. Letters that made enemies human and heroes complicated and simple stories inadequate. The official Army history of prisoner-of-war camps in the Philippines would eventually mention the Cabanatuan breakout in a single paragraph, noting that coordinated prisoner action resulted in the neutralization of perimeter security and successful escape of multiple personnel. There would be no mention of McKenna, no recognition of the 11 minutes that had transformed broken men back into soldiers, no acknowledgement of the rifle that had made it all possible, which was exactly how McKenna wanted it. Fame would have required him to tell simple stories about complex realities, to reduce human experiences to propaganda that served political purposes rather than historical truth. The silence was a burden, but it was also a form of integrity, a refusal to let his experience be transformed into something that would make war seem glorious rather than necessary, heroic rather than tragic. When McKenna died in 1987, the Springfield passed to his daughter, who knew only that it had been important to her father in ways she couldn't fully understand. The letters were donated to a local historical society, where they remain largely unread, primary sources that reveal truths too complicated for most historians to address. But among the families of the men who'd walked out of that camp, the story lived on in a different form. They spoke not of heroes and villains, but of dignity reclaimed with 8 cartridges and an old man's patience. They remembered the moment when the mocked became the liberator, when a farm rifle proved that courage and skill mattered more than the opinions of those who had never faced the test themselves. And sometimes, late at night in places like San Antonio and Detroit and San Francisco, old men would hold weapons that had brought them home and wonder if anyone would ever understand the weight of what they'd carried. Not just rifles and ammunition, but the knowledge that enemies were human beings and heroes were complicated, and the truth was always more difficult than the stories people wanted to hear. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. What do you do when the most important truths are the ones that nobody wants to hear?